Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. And in this episode, we are so fortunate. We have with us Brian Cranley. So say hello to everybody, Brian.
Hello, everyone. Thank you guys for having me on. Appreciate it.
We are really, I feel very honored to have you on the podcast. And I know that you have written a book. And in our last podcast, we actually did have a conversation based on some of the words, because we haven't read your book. I haven't read your book. I hope maybe Stephen have read a little bit more now, but I haven't. I'm just too busy. Mm-hmm. You did it yesterday. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah. But that means that we had a podcast based on some of the assumption that we have connected to your books. But in my opinion, I guess the book is much more richer than we were able to, just to read some of the headlines. So I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. And unfortunately, also Cameron are not able to participate with us today. And I guess he is the one who you have been in contact with.
Yeah.
So maybe Stephen, would you, or maybe Brian, would you try to explain a little bit more? What do you understand? What is your picture on the question about Athens and Jerusalem?
And your inspiration for the book?
Yeah. So I love this podcast and that idea. So I was trained in a Catholic seminary education, which, follows the classic philosophy before theology. And so there's a big focus on how the Greek philosophers intertwined with monotheism. And for some reason, that just personally fascinated me and stuck with me for the last 15, 20 years. The idea that you're trying to take these unbreakable laws of reason to describe God in these, very specific ways. And then how the ancient philosophers in chapter 4, I go through how Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all went through this process of trying to meld reason with their theologies. And I just found that fascinating, and even more fascinating that all three of them kind of settled on the same arguments and then built their theologies behind that. So the first half of the book really is a summary of that discussion. Chapter 1 is the problem between faith and science and kind of the introduction to reason and faith and how they can go together. But then chapter 2 is how Plato began that discussion by talking about universals and where those exist. And then how Aristotle took on that discussion with his potentiality and actuality, and where he said the forms were. And then chapter 4 is what I was talking about, how Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all wove that conversation of Athens into their monotheism. And in chapter 5, I end with Thomas Aquinas because I think he did the best job of summarizing all the arguments and kind of he had access to everyone. So he summarized every philosopher and theologian and this whole conversation very well. So I kind of go through his divine attributes at the end. And that whole summary is the first half of book 1 that I'm trying to share with people, this education that so many modern people don't have access to anymore.
And that was the first part of the book. And I guess then also the second one is more from a scientific perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you want to talk about the second part?
Yeah.
Okay, so the second part, I kind of summarize this conversation of rational faith, and it ends part 1 with Thomas Aquinas's divine attributes, that God is sort of one and indivisible, eternal, infinite, and that he is unknowable. And then the second part is sort of the bold claim of the book that these attributes can be found in science, and specifically in like the whole idea for the book came when I heard the theories on the very first moment of the Big Bang, where time equals 10 to the negative 43, the Planck time. And the way they were talking about the unity of the early universe was just mind-blowing. That Einstein's famous equation where mass equals energy. And then the grand unified theory talking about how the 4 forces of physics might have been all one and the same force. And so the way that science describes that first moment of time sounded oddly similar to how Aquinas, Augustine, Plato, and Aristotle talk about the divine simplicity, where all things are one in God. And so the idea for the book stemmed from this idea that maybe God wrote his rational attributes into the science of the universe. And so the book goes through how we see these attributes in the Big Bang, in the evolution of life, and then how the human mind works as distinct from all the other animals, which I kind of was learning as I went, just kind of kept developing, and it became kind of fascinating. So yeah, it's a good read.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have to read it.
So trying to sum up what your main points are, maybe tell me if this is like a good summary, that you basically have 2 main like bridges between science and religion. The first being the sense of wonder that both share, the wonder at the cosmos, at the beauty of it, the complexity of it, the underlying simplicity of it, and so forth. And secondly, that at least in the Judeo-Christian Islamic theological tradition and in the scientific tradition, there's a shared sense that there's order and structure and reason that things follow in a kind of mathematical precision, that logic works basically. Sort of combination of wonder and logic. And with those 2, major foundation stones, why aren't they talking more? Why isn't there more agreement between science and religion?
Yes. So when I was writing the book, I knew I wanted the word wonder in the title. Mm-hmm. And the reason for me, sometimes it has kind of a cheesy connotation to it, but the reason for me was a lot of people have said that wonder is sort of the human experience that unites the philosopher, the theologian, and even the atheist scientist. All of us can, relate with this awe when you look at the universe, when you look at images from the James Webb Telescope or the beauty of biological life. We all have this awe and wonder. But Socrates talked about the examined life and how, philosophy begins in this inquiry, this curiosity to know. There's something in the human person that has to keep seeking, has to find. It's almost insatiable. Like you can never reach the end of our desire to know. And so that's what drives the scientist, the philosopher. And then when you get into theologies, I think, it's that same sort of experience. So I definitely wanted wonder in the title, but I also put the call of wonder because I wanted to express that, we are the ones that are responding to wonder that's already present. And it's sort of this idea that God obviously is the source of all this wonder, and that it's not ours to create, but rather ours to enjoy and respond to, and that he's calling us through the created world to that.
One of the discussion we had last time was that is it necessarily that we have to have this idea about God when we talk about this wonder? And I think some of the distinction might be just on what kind of words we are using when we are trying to express what is actually this notion of something that is bringing it all together. So, but I'm just curious if you discuss this in the book, and what kind of, is it God, or could it be like divinity or eternity, or is it something else?
I mean, that's a great question. I tried to cover so many things in the book. I couldn't go into fine details, but I'm reading Edward Fesser's book, The 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. And it's just, summarizing the 5 major proofs: Augustine, Aristotle, Leibniz, the rationalist proof, and Aquinas. And he goes into much better detail about the divine attributes, which I talk about. God is one, infinite, eternal, mystery, also the necessary being. And so in philosophy, you have this explanation of something you could call just divinity. You could call it, I don't know, the foundation being, something like that, the foundation of being. But if you follow the divine attributes to their logical conclusions, you almost get this necessary description of God. He has to be unchanging, infinite, eternal, incorruptible, incorporeal. So there's these attributes that I guess you could say it could be just the universe or something, but I think it when you get really into the details of the divine attributes, it almost has to be what monotheism calls God. So in my book, I just call it God. And, I'm trying to explain to people the rational ideas behind it for the people that never got that education. But I don't know what on y'all's podcasts, what have y'all discussed as possible what that could be?
One thing we return to fairly frequently, it seems, is the let's call it the fact of the unknowability of God.
Okay.
That divinity is so far beyond our conception and imagination that any attempt at confining it within any kind of categories may invite fundamental misunderstandings that kind of slip in through the back door until we're talking and we don't realize that we're all using these words, but do the words really mean what we think they mean? For example, Aquinas's proofs of the existence of God. There's already assumptions behind that. The idea that you can apply, say, logical proofs to God's existence is that God is that sort of being, whose existence can even be proven in the first place. That
Right.
to talk about God existing, to talk about God causing certain phenomena in the world or not being the direct cause of phenomena in the world. The idea that there's one God versus many gods, or a God in different aspects. These things which we consider so fundamental. We think, well, obviously you can say this or that is true or false about God. But if God is truly unknowable, then
Mm-hmm.
then are we at least in uncertain ground when we try to make any kind of truth claims about particularly the operation of God in the universe?
Yeah, that's a great point. I use that unknowability of God as one of the major things in my book, and it's really brought me to think about how we define mystery and how we define, like you're talking about, the unknowability of God. And for a lot of people, I see this when I talk to my friends that maybe don't like philosophy or have never had that education. When it gets difficult to think about, a lot of people just stop. That hurts my brain. I don't want to go there. But I think with the mystery of God, and this is where I see it also in the mystery of science, is I feel like the divine mystery is logical and sort of infinitely understandable without ever understanding it completely. So almost like taking a cup of water out of the ocean. You are going to learn more every time you go back to the divine mystery. You will learn things about God, but you'll never know him and reach the end type of thing. And so I feel like that is the exact same thing in science when we're researching maybe the origin of the universe, we very slowly, as a human community, we learn more about science. We learn more about the Big Bang, but it's almost, you're never going to see outside the observable universe, most likely. I don't know how that could happen, but there's this element of mystery that's endless. And in that way, I feel like it resembles a divine mystery. So I would say God is, not knowable in a positive sense. And I talk about, the negative terms, knowing God negatively or analogically, but I don't want that to be a deterrent for people not to try to understand him and, read these ideas and arguments that are 2,000 years old or more, because I think there is something to be known and eternally, you can eternally find out more, but you'll never get to the end. You'll never, if you know God, that means you're equal to or above him. So you'll never know him in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the last thing is, of course, if we had known him, and as you said, and we've got to, and it's like a hubris thought we have.
Yeah.
We have also discussed this idea about monotheism versus more pluralistic way of thinking on these. And I know that I'm more on a monotheistic way of thinking than Stephen is. But Stephen, could you try to distinguish in a short way these two?
Well, I guess further to my earlier comment, if one is willing to accept the premise of a kind of radical unknowability of the divine, then whether we picture a monotheistic God, let's say in the traditional Judeo-Christian Islamic terms, as an uncaused cause that does really exist, that may periodically interpose in the workings of nature and so forth, that conception of God versus a non-theistic conception of the divine, such as in Buddhism, where there certainly is, let's say, a directionality to the universe, in the sense that there's right action that is somehow aligned with some deeper principles, whether or not we identify it as a being, which seems on the face of it to be like an incompatible theology, because one would say God exists and the other would say, well, either don't know or don't believe in God. And then maybe even a third option of God is realized in different avatars. Just go back a few thousand years, and that was the standard way of relating to the divine across human cultures, through pantheons of gods and so forth. Are to what extent are, just to take these three as like three options on the table before us, if we're going to talk about how we relate to God, to some extent we take monotheism as like the default option, partly I think for cultural reasons. We're largely, most of us, certainly in the US, we're born into a culture which takes that as the given. To what extent is it really the given? To what extent are there other legitimately different ways of conceptualizing the divine and its action in the world that may end up in a very similar place in terms of prescriptions for human action? Again, I'm thinking of like Buddhism, which has such a very different theology, but you look at the Eightfold Way, you look at like the moral grounding of Buddhism, and it's not that different from Christianity. How does one explain that, given that their conceptions of God are so completely different? And does that throw us back to maybe a kind of, I don't know, epistemological humility about the whole thing, that we don't know, we really don't know.
Right. We don't know. And I'd probably not be a good person to answer that, because I am aware that I have been formed in this classical theism, and it is very hard for me to get outside the idea. The idea is, if God is infinite, there can only be one infinity. These logical, you can't have two infinities. And so that's like so stuck in my head that it's hard for me to get out. But, I'm thinking of like Ryan Holiday, who is big on Stoicism, but I'm pretty sure he's atheist. And I'm always fascinated at this sort of, he's writing, a book series on the virtues: wisdom, temperance, justice, courage. And so he's writing a book series on acting well, like good ethical behavior, but he's atheist. And I just find it fascinating listening to, and, Buddhist might be a step in between there. It might be just past atheism, or this idea that the universe are still a good, right, moral way to act. I just personally can't get past the way I've been formed. So I in my mind, I keep thinking there can only be one infinity, but I think it is a very worthwhile discussion for everyone to have, because you're not going to convince everyone that God exists, and you're not going to convince people that your God exists compared to theirs. But I love the discussion. I just find it fascinating personally. So I think it's a worthwhile discussion, because we need to act well in humanity.
In the spirit of starting from a point of agreement, one of the most trenchant critics of organized religion, one might say, was the late great Carl Sagan. Was such a fantastic popularizer of science.
Yeah.
And I want to read one of my favorite quotations from Sagan as a starting point, because it seems from this starting point that there really oughtn't to be any serious conflict. He says, "Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light years and in a passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both." And I loved how strongly stated that was. But then if you read, of course, Carl Sagan's, more deeply into Carl Sagan's writings, he comes out as an extremely harsh critic of organized religion. So in his mind, there's a big difference between spirituality, which he is a proponent of, and organized religion, which he's a heavy critic of. And somewhere in there, I think might be a useful distinction to make, or a way that we can push against some of these ideas. Compatibility, great, but there is tension. If there wasn't tension, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. So where is the tension in, according to Carl Sagan, or according to one of these critics?
I'll ask you this. I think it's in the word spirituality. What do you think, from knowing his work, what he means by spirituality, in that sense?
I think it's wonder.
Yeah,
wonder. Just that human experience of something deeper, something out there. So what I would say is, I'm doing the opposite of Carl Sagan in my book. So Carl Sagan is he atheist? Was he proclaimed atheist? Okay. So he's an atheist trying to bring in the religious side of it and say it's still spiritual, it's okay, and trying to make peace with the religious side. And I'm on the religious side trying to say, no, we can take all the science as it is. We don't have to be afraid of science, and God's image is still in it. And so I think what he's doing with that word spirituality, and what a lot of people, Harris, I think, is one of the main guys right now talking about spirituality from an atheist perspective, is everyone's recognizing there's something in us that sees what dogs and cats don't see in the world. There's something deeper out there, mathematics, whatever it is. And so they're trying to reconcile that with an atheistic worldview, and believers are trying to reconcile it with a religious worldview. But I think, in my mind, I can't get over the fact that when people say things like that, they're just screaming, I have a soul. I have something in me that's more than just biology, that recognizes God's image in the cosmos. And so what I was trying to do in my book is just kind of explain a little bit more about how God wrote his image into the cosmos, so that when you're looking up at the Andromeda galaxy or whatever, the Milky Way, I feel like you're looking at an image of God, and that's why it causes wonder. It's an image of his infinity. It's an image of his eternity and beauty. And so you're seeing a physical image of God that he made in his image, in his sense. And so I think that's what causes wonder. But my argument is that it's because we have a soul, and that's why you have wonder in the first place.
Is that also why when you use the example of I don't remember the name of the person, but the one who's writing on Stoicism and virtues?
Yeah, Ryan Holiday.
Ryan Holiday, yes, and that he's in a way is missing the essential point that to have virtues in a stoicistic way, you actually have to have a metaphysical or religious.
Yeah, and that's obviously another huge argument, debate. I would say it's unintelligible to me to have virtues at all if we live in a complete atheist materialist universe. There shouldn't be this sort of inner conscience in all of us that we all experience when we, if you make 100 bad choices, you feel miserable, you feel terrible, you feel like you're whatever, you get depressed. There's an effect on you, and I feel like if there's no moral agent or moral standard in the universe, then I don't see why that would happen. But on the other side, they're arguing, hey, it's humanity trying to bring about the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, like a utilitarian effect. I don't think that jives with everyone's internal experience in reality, but I like the argument, and I think it's beneficial to have.
When I'm trying to probe, where the actual source of conflict is that needs to be resolved, it seems to me that when we talk about, say, a logically framed universe that is filled with wonder, there's really no necessary conflict between science and religion. And here, when I say religion, I'll assume the sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic, Western religion.
Okay.
Because in the scientific framework, you have the laws of nature that that are the sort of the ground of all processes that we can observe, that do a great job of allowing us to leverage our knowledge to make predictions and to control the world around us, and that the fact that it works speaks to the probable correctness of the model.
Yeah.
In on the side of religion, one can also, particularly in like in the case of Christian theology, take sort of as a starting point this idea of logos, this idea of reason, of order, that there's a purpose behind things, that that if there are specific acts of divine intervention, like the working of miracles and so forth, that could always be arranged by an all-powerful creator to happen in some way that's behind the scenes, in some way that's not directly observable. Thus maintaining, the consistency, the sort of the mathematical consistency of the universe. But probing a little bit further, there may be the one sort of hint of a conflict emerges when we compare and contrast the two. On the cases of science, there is no ultimate purpose that emerges from all these processes. There's mathematical consistency and regularity. There's all this complexity, and out of this emerges this great sense of awe and wonder when we contemplate it and so forth. But it's not heading towards a particular purpose. Whereas in the case of the theological perspective, there is order and consistency and wonder. And in addition to that, behind it is a purpose, that it's come from God and returning to God, and that there's a moral objective to human life. There's right and wrong. There are authoritative and non-authoritative sources of knowledge, and so forth. And that's something that's just absent in the scientific picture.
Right.
Is this an area of how do you resolve this tension?
That's a big question. How do you resolve that tension? Well, I guess I would need to hear more from the atheist perspective, or just the science apart from atheist perspective, that you say that whole purpose and moral is absent, because it seems like they're still out there trying to explain it, and they're trying to come up with reasons on why just human consciousness itself has this need for purpose, or like Ryan Holiday, why we should act rightly in a world doesn't have a God. I mean, to me, I would say that if you believe in a God and a soul, then there's consequences to that. You have to, accept the messiness of religion. And a lot of people don't want to, religion's done some bad things on almost every religion throughout the years. And so if you accept, okay, there is a God, and okay, I do have a soul, now that means you got to get into which religion's right. And I don't really want to be a part of these specific people. And maybe there's eternal consequences. Maybe there is an afterlife and a heaven and hell. And so I think it gets messy, and it gets serious, and it makes you make some different choices. So I don't know, maybe that's part of the tension is if I say this basic, there is a God or there is something out there, then I have to do all these other things that I don't want to do. I don't know, but from my side of it, I'm trying to relieve the tension that faith is irrational. Like I believe it is rational, and that's the part of it that I find the most fascinating. And I just enjoy learning about. So for me, I'm trying to relieve that tension, but I'm not sure on the other side of it what the tension point is. Why it would be hard to say, okay, there's something that exists, a necessary cause, or a foundational being. But yeah, I'll have to think about that one. That's a good question.
Yeah, so one area of tension would be this question. Well, is there like purpose built into the universe, or isn't there? Which is kind of like a theological, or let's say a metaphysical tension.
Yeah.
Another possible tension would be more in the area of epistemology, and this is where you actually quote Stephen Hawking in your book, and in one or two sentences he raises what some would consider to be like the fundamental tension, at least in terms of how we approach the world. And he said, Hawking says that there's a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. And so, from the religious perspective, are you willing to be proved wrong? Is doubt a virtue? Is doubting everything a virtue? Or is having unshakable faith the higher virtue than doubting everything? Because
That's
if
a
you ask a
great question.
scientist, they would say, I doubt everything. It's my job.
Yeah.
And when I'm proven wrong, that's one of my happy days, because, at least I can cross that possible theory off of my list, and I don't have to waste any more time on this because it's been proven wrong. And so getting proved wrong is a great thing for a scientist. Being proven wrong, as a believer, that may be a crisis of faith.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I think I personally am okay with doubting because I've tried to learn so much about all the different views. I purposefully try to put myself in the shoes of the other view. And I've read as much as I can find so far on, A Universe from Nothing by Krauss, which is an atheist explanation for how a universe can spring from negative gravity. I feel like I'm open to be proven wrong. It's so hard with religion and with atheism because I feel like logic is not what makes you make your decision. I feel like it's your personal experience in the end that is the final step. The leap of faith, I feel like, is what your personal experience is when you are open to the idea that God exists. And I feel like that's the final decision for people. I know for me, I enjoy the logical explanations for God, but it's not like you can prove him definitively. You can't prove God 100% just from logic. Well, some people think you can, but it's your experience in the end. And Alex O'Connor is a famous YouTube atheist right now. And I remember listening to his testimony, and he has a degree from Oxford, Johns College, Oxford, in theology. And he went through his experience of talking to God and saying, I'm going to do everything possible to experience God. And, he was in theology. He was a believer, I guess. And so he went to Bible studies. He lived with people that were believers and all these things. And he experienced, he said he felt nothing, not one thing ever. He never felt like God reached out to him. No experience. And I just sat there thinking, man, my experience is so different. And that is, I think, where the decision point is made. Because, I can say atheist arguments, problem of suffering. There seems to be natural causes for things like the universe and life from non-life. I can see how those are rational arguments. And if I didn't have my personal experience, I might lean more that way. Alex O'Connor, he knows the cosmological arguments. He knows Aquinas. I'm sure he would say those are rational arguments, and they're not like completely irrational. He understands them. But his experience is what made the deciding factor for him. So, I don't mean to get off topic, but in my next book that I'm already thinking about, I'm thinking about that experience side. as compared to just the intellect, the thinking about God.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps or not,
No,
but
it seems to me that we're right on top of like the essential distinction.
yeah,
And maybe we can like get more sort of clarity around that by looking at the specific example of the Bible. Um, and I love what you've done with some of the Bible stories in your book, like with the story of Genesis, which could be
yeah,
read out in a sort of straightforward, like factual, historical, this is what happened on this day, and this is what happened next, and this person lived for so many years, and they begat so and so, and all of that. And and you were willing um, to take the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis and read it out in far more kind of symbolic form. Um, and I appreciated that reading, and I wondered if that sort of symbolic reading extends into the New Testament for you.
um, it extends to each book. I think each book of the Bible, Old and New, has to be read as what type of book it was meant to be. So the Psalms were, I think, liturgical songs. It's a song book. The New Testament, the Gospels seem to be more like eyewitness accounts. So I wouldn't take them the same way that I would take Genesis, which seems to be Near East Mesopotamian poetry in style. So I think truth comes through every book of the Bible, but in a different way, if that makes sense. But in the Gospels, it seems more like eyewitness account. Obviously, Paul's letters were letters to churches. Revelation, yeah, I would take Revelation very symbolic, much like some of the parts of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another really sticky situation into who has the authority to interpret the books in what way. So yeah, I'm glad you like that Adam and Eve story. I put it in later because I felt like I really wanted to put it in, but I was wondering how it would come across.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I personally I read out the Bible in symbolic terms.
Yeah.
I don't feel that I'm missing like the true point of it when reading things out in symbolic terms. But I'm willing to take it all the way to the end of the Bible. Of course, Revelation,
Mm-hmm.
but also the stories of the miracles of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. Um, for me, one can read those out in symbolic terms without losing the essence of it. And I'm obviously I'm on I'm not in the majority here when it comes to one's reading the Bible.
Yeah.
But if as someone with a background in and a scientific training, um, I see the world through the lens of rational processes of structures that are consistent over time, then considering the literal truth of something like the raising of the dead, which happens not just once in the New Testament, but you also have Lazarus. It seems to me that thinking of resurrection as a symbol for spiritual awakening is to me a more comfortable way of reading it out, in a way um, that doesn't bring in what seems to me to be a kind of irreconcilable tension between science and religion otherwise.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I would disagree in the sense that if the resurrection didn't happen, with the body of Jesus, then the conquering of death doesn't necessarily happen. But
Mm-hmm.
it does bring up a new definition of miracles that I've been working through since writing the book. And I mentioned it, you probably read it in chapter 10. I just put 2 paragraphs in about comparison to how, I'm making this claim that the Big Bang is a miracle, but it also has naturalistic explanations. Abiogenesis, where life comes from non-living matter, is a miracle, but it also has naturalistic component to it. And that the first human out of the primate line was the miracle of Adam and Eve type thing. So then I talk about how Jesus's miracles tend to have this same, and the miracles of the Old Testament, all the miracles of Scripture have this same quality to them, where they're a supernatural effect occurring through a natural medium. And what I mean by that is, like, God appears as a burning bush. He doesn't appear as like a glowing alien or something. He uses something from the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
He parts an actual sea. Jesus uses mud to heal. He doesn't just, it's not like fireworks are coming out of his fingers like the Emperor from Star Wars. He uses something natural to perform every miracle. And, with the resurrection, he's obviously using his own body. But this idea that I feel like God, through science and wonder, is trying to raise up the natural world in our minds and always remind us, hey, this world is good. This world, just like I said in Genesis, it is good. So in that regard, I would say the resurrection had to use the actual body of Jesus, but I understand your reading if Jesus is not the necessary part of dying and rising for our resurrection, if God, is still doing that somehow.
Mm-hmm. So how do you reconcile then a resurrection event with the existence of natural laws? How does God and why does God and when does God choose to intervene in the normal operation of the laws of the universe to get something else done that wouldn't happen otherwise? I mean, is that like a countable number of times that that's happened? Did it only happen during the time of the Old and New Testament? Is it still happening today? If it's happening today, is it observable? I mean, where does one go with this?
That's a great question. I think it's still happening today. But he doesn't often break the laws of nature or the laws of physics. And I guess that would be a discussion of if death was part of the original plan or not. Like when people say they were prayed over, my knee was busted and someone prayed over me and it got better. I do believe in healings like that, but again, it doesn't seem to, it almost looks like the body just heals itself. Like there's this natural explanation almost every time God acts. And so somehow I feel like he's above the laws of nature, but he always respects the laws of nature in some way. He doesn't just break physics sometimes. I don't know. That's a good question.
Doesn't break physics?
Well, it breaks natural death. Yeah, I guess he breaks it in the resurrection. I would say that's limited when he does break the laws of nature. Yeah. But I guess, was death part of the original plan? That's another question. Or did Adam and Eve mess that up for us?
Well, does there have to be death? Is death a necessary part of the world for there to be renewal? I mean, we look at physical processes and everything seems to be cyclical, from the orbits of the planets to the orbits of these, the orbits of this passage of the seasons and so forth. If we didn't have the passages of the seasons, we couldn't have life on Earth in any way that we know it. If people didn't die, then there'd be no room for new generations to come and to push consciousness forward, to push spirituality.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Yeah, so we have, I'm sure you've studied Big Crunch, Big Bang cosmology, where the idea that we're in a cyclical type universe that's continually expanding and then crunching. That would kind of go with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also fascinating. Yeah. I'll have to think about that.
I'm not sure if Stephen, if you have more questions about the book, but I would like to ask you, Brian, about you might not have any yet, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on what your book or your thoughts on this. How could education? What kind of education? What could we change in our education to bring in these thoughts in a better way than we are doing nowadays?
That's a good question. Also, I think the rational arguments for God's existence and the rational divine attributes are what bring me together with Judaism and Islam in the book, and that's, I only put those three in because they share that, and those are the ones I've studied mostly. But I think that language of reason and logic is something that everyone can discuss. So even atheists can, they can discuss arguments against. I think that gives us a common language. And so maybe reintroducing both sides of the argument, but some of those logical reasonings, I don't think those they're definitely not in public school. You'd have to go to probably a Catholic school or, some liberal arts college. And you could find that. So that's part of what I'm trying to do with this book is get a very quick summary of the education out to people to kind of catch them up on the past discussion of 2,000 years, because that discussion's still happening today. But if you don't know this background of rational discussion, then it's hard to join it. Then you get the loud sort of battle, which is kind of like young earth creationism, which is literal Genesis took exactly 6 days to create. And then you have atheist materialists who obviously can't accept that view because science shows something totally different. And then these guys over here saying, no, everything's exactly literal. We can't accept anything from science. So you have this loud battle happening on the edges, but in the middle, there's some really fascinating, people that are bringing it together, like the BioLogos Institute. Hugh Ross is like an old earth creationist, but they all have ideas. Stephen C. Myers' Return of the God Hypothesis. I think if you get caught up on the conversation that's been happening for 2,000 years, then I think that will help people find what they have in common, if that makes sense.
It makes sense for me, and also I think just if we were able to bring these discussions alive in school, I think that would have been a huge step forward.
Yeah. I think you guys are doing that with the podcast. I mean, obviously this type of discussion helps make the conversation noticed and brings more people into it.
Hopefully, but yeah, we don't have too many listeners, but we have a lot of listeners from many countries.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I think that's very nice.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's also when we have been talking now, because you said that you focus on the monotheistic religious perspectives, and
yeah,
just wondering if it would be, I think it would be great to bring in more
religions.
Buddhistic, different kind of religious perspectives. That would be really.
Yeah, I mean, in Hinduism, I think there's the idea of Brahman as the great sort of God above all gods type thing. And I think I just don't know enough about it to speak to it. But I think you could bring Hinduism in. Buddhism's different, though. Buddhism, I can't figure out if it believes in a God or not. I don't think it does it? Nirvana. How would you express nirvana, the idea of the perfect state?
Roughly, we would say it's heaven, but not with the same kind of theological undergirding. But when you start from different theologies, but end in such a similar place morally in terms of what constitutes the good life and what constitutes a moral life, I can't help but suspect that there's something about the premises, about our theological constructs, which we might assume to be incompatible. We might really kind of fight against these other theologies. We might consider ours to be correct and the others to be, wavered in some way. But I can't help but suspect that there's something off about that, that maybe different theological perspectives, which historically have been considered completely at odds with each other, maybe are just a matter of different personalities, just like humans are born with very different personalities, and we're not trying, we don't imagine that the best possible world is one in which everybody has the same personality. There are people who are more rational and logical, and there are people who are much more intuitive and touchy-feely, and that's part of the wonderful aspect of humanity. And we wouldn't want to change that. Would we want to, is the best possible world one in which this theological rainbow is reduced to one color by some by whatever process, logical process of exclusion, which probably is not going to work. That's been tried for thousands of years.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
conflict has been tried. Obviously, that's not the way forward. You know, what what's the way forward for humanity theologically? Are we headed towards a state in which there's consensus about fundamental questions like God and how God acts in the universe? Or are we headed towards more of a pluralistic, stable but pluralistic spiritual religious scenario where you continue to have, you know, different kinds of theological systems, but like as I already mentioned, the example of Buddhism and Christianity that are not in conflict with each other when you look at individuals living their lives out in accordance with those spiritual prescriptions.
Yeah. Well, I think you definitely have to preserve human freedom, right? I don't think any sort of forcing people to believe your way is a good idea. But I do think like these discussions using, what are the few things we can say about God, or why is acting virtuously a good thing for everyone? Like you said, all religions seem to arrive there, even atheists, which is mind blowing, fascinating. Um, and so I think if you keep the logical arguments going, the how to be a good human conversation going, and the freedom, preserving freedom, I don't see one world religion happening anytime soon. So I think that's the right way forward. Respecting each other, agreeing on what we agree on, and being open and with what we disagree on, but not in a forceful, argumentative way, but just an honest way that still respects the other person. That's interesting. One color of the rainbow. Yeah. Doesn't seem as pretty, huh?
I don't know if you've read much Teilhard de Chardin, but he was a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
Also a paleontologist from the mid 20th century. And
I have his book and I haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
I have it in the other room. I will read it.
He's written several books, and I highly recommend. I think you would absolutely love them because he's writing from a deep faith perspective, but at the same time one which is informed by science and his understanding of evolution. And he found a way of harmonizing the physical facts of human evolution on this planet, which admittedly are not still have mysteries,
Sure.
but the outlines of which seem to be quite well established scientifically, factually. And he found a way to harmonize that picture of human evolution with his spiritual Catholic beliefs. And in a way that actually it seems to me to mirror a bit of the ending of your book, the idea that everything comes from God and returns to God, that there's Christ says he's the Alpha and the Omega, he's the beginning point and the end point in time. And that's something that was, I think, a great theme of Teilhard.
Yeah, he talks about the Omega point, right? That everything is sort of evolving towards the spiritual Omega point.
Yes.
I've heard that idea about, I am excited to read it. You're the second person that's told me to read his work. So I need to get on that.
I think you'll find a soul brother there.
Yeah. Is there one book you recommend? I think I have The Transformation of Man, something like that.
Yeah, I read The Phenomenon of Man. And
Phenomenon of Man. That's right.
That's the one that immediately springs to mind, but there's several. Yeah.
I think to the listeners, Stephen, you have to tell the name of the author one more time.
Oh, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah. And I think the recommendation of Chardin and also the words that Brian gave us in the end about the rainbow, I think that's a good ending of the podcast. So thank you very much for being part of this podcast, Brian. And,
I appreciate it. Yeah, I love this conversation. Thank you. Yeah,
and I have to say that that's maybe one of the most. It's very inspiring to have this conversation. We have it once a month, and bring it out to the listeners.
Yeah, I'll have to read Chardin, and we'll have to do another one.
Yeah, because that was what I was thinking of, Stephen. That maybe we should try to go forward with Chardin and to tell the listeners a little bit more about his work.
Yeah,
that would be a great next
episode. Great.
So thank you for listening, and see you next
Thanks,
time.
Brian. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.